Hi, it's Emily from the Rockport Public Library, and I'm here to share another First Chapter Friday with you. This week we're going to be reading the first chapter of The Counter Clockwise Heart by Brian Farrey. This is a new book. It's a fantasy book about two children named Alphonsus and Esme, and one of them, Alphonsus, has a clock in his chest where his heart should be. Chapter 1 is called The Boy Who Talked to Stone. It was the coldest winter morning ever on record in the Empire of Rheinwelt when the people of Somber End awoke to find the Onyx Maiden in their tiny village. The night before, they'd gone to bed, fireplaces blazing to ward off the bitter chill, safe in the knowledge that a statue of Rudolf Emmerich stood watch over the village center. Emmerich, Somber End's long-deceased first burgermeister, was a beloved figure in the town's history even to that very day. So you can imagine the distress when dawn broke and the shivering residents scurried across the roundel in the village center on their way to work, only to find chunks of Emmerich's statue everywhere. A hand here, a kneecap there. Clearly there would be no repairing the venerated idol, as much of its considerable girth had been ground into dark gray powder. Where Rudolf Emmerich had once stood, gazing wistfully over the town he'd helped settle, something far less reassuring now held reign. As tall as a 2-story house, a maiden made entirely of rough, dappled onyx loomed over the roundel. Adorned in armor, she appeared to be in the midst of a battle. Her right arm was thrown back, ready to strike with a cat-o'-nine-tails covered in rocky spikes. Her wild hair, blowing in an unseen gale, reached out in all directions like a demonic compass rose. Most terrifying of all was her face, frozen in a permanent angry scream. Who could have done this, some villagers murmured. The Empire's most contentious neighbors, the mysterious denizens of the hinterlands, were unlikely culprits. No one had ever seen these creatures. They were, again, mysterious. But the feral howls that rang out from the barren landscape to the west didn't come from anyone who might deliver an arguably symbolic statue. How could it just appear? Others asked. If the statue was the height of a house, it must have weighed twice as much. Moving it would have been tricky at best. Few ventured theories because the most obvious answer, given the fate of the Emmerich statue, was that the maiden had simply fallen from the sky. Still other villagers asked a far wiser question. Why did this happen? These were the people who understood that sometimes whos and hows didn't amount to nearly as much importance as whys. When the rulers of Rheinwelt, Imperatrix Dagmar and her wife, Empress Sabine, received news of the maiden's mysterious appearance, they sent emissaries throughout the land seeking answers. Master scholars pored over ancient tomes, but found nothing. The Hierophants, keepers of the most mystical and arcane knowledge, had recently fled Rheinwelt, it was rumored, afraid to speak the terrible truths they knew. Soothsayers far and wide cast bones and consulted the ether. They all offered the same dire warning. One day the maiden would waken and bring a terrible reckoning. Not just a Somber End, but all throughout the Empire. This was too much. The villagers already lived under constant threat. The unseen inhabitants of the hinterlands could attack at any moment. Mysterious, many believed, and dangerous. If or when an attack came, the people of Somber End would immediately be on the front line. Perhaps worse was the fact that the Hexen Woods, home to a terrible sorceress known as the Nachtfrau, curved around the village's northern perimeter. It was said the Nachtfrau prowled the dreams of the villagers at night and would curse any who even thought of entering her forest. The statue's presence was one dormant threat too many. The people of Somber End wasted no time. Life came to a standstill as everyone in the village devoted themselves to a solitary task, getting rid of the Onyx Maiden. Moving the statue proved impossible. 100 horses with chained harnesses failed to budge the maiden. It was like an invisible giant hand held her firmly in place. Attempts to destroy her proved equally futile. Anyone who took chisel to or in any way tried to damage the maiden fell gravely ill for days or even weeks, and never once was a scratch made to her impervious stone visage. 2 months of solid scheming proved fruitless. The Onyx Maiden wasn't going anywhere. Many people moved away to other towns in the vast empire, choosing to be as far from Somber End as possible to avoid the day when the maiden finally awoke. Those who remained, most of them couldn't afford to move or had nowhere else to go, lived their lives walking on eggshells. No one knew what might rouse the maiden from her troubled slumber. Few, if any, mentioned what was only ever whispered. It was called the coincidence, because no one wanted to believe it was more calculated than that. Ever since the maiden's arrival, Somber End's fortunes had taken a marked turn for the worse. Crops failed, cows gave half as much milk, storms struck far more regularly and did much more damage. Fearful of the maiden's wrath, neighboring towns refused to do business with what they believed to be a cursed village. Soon, those who'd stayed behind found themselves living in a dying town. Then, one day, nearly 6 months after the maiden first arrived, something curious happened. A poor, unassuming boy named Guntram Steinhertz, only just turned 11, went up to the roundel and stared up into the maiden's furious, cold eyes. His parents had all but forgotten him. They were consumed with their own worries, often leaving their son to find his own way. Guntram fed himself. He kept the family's paltry fires stoked. He had no friends, so he was very lonely. Unable to bear the neglect, Guntram went to the statue, hoping she would rise up, eat him alive, and teach his parents and the children who mocked him a lesson. But his desire to be eaten vanished once he met the maiden's horrific gaze. Guntram was a boy whose blessing and curse was a powerful imagination. Where others saw ferocity in the statue's eyes, Guntram saw power. And at that first glance, he conjured 100 stories in his head about how the maiden had come to Somber End. She was an enchantress whose spell had backfired, turning her to stone. She was a princess from a neighboring monarchy, fleeing from usurpers, whose only protection was to become a statue. She was the greatest achievement of a downtrodden mason who'd hoped the errant wish he'd made on a star would bring her to life to be his bride. None of these stories explained the maiden's terrifying countenance or warlike stance. That didn't matter to Guntram. He only knew she was powerful, and when she awakened, he didn't want to be her enemy. So he began talking to the maiden. Each day, as the sun rose, Guntram would come to the roundel, sit cross-legged at the statue's base, and talk. He would tell the maiden the history of Somber End. He would invent stories of ferocious warriors and fantastic creatures. At night before bed, he told her his fears and dreams and hopes. He confessed how he hated his family's meager existence and how he longed to live in a castle with more money than he'd ever need. He ended each night by touching the base of the statue and promising, "I'll be back tomorrow." And then, after a week of this, a second curious thing happened. The crops started to grow again. The cows became bountiful. Storms turned to gentle rain. Traders who'd avoided the village returned to do business. Life became what it had once been under the watchful eye of the Emmerich statue. In fact, life became better. No one knew how the boy had changed things. The more Guntram wove his stories, the more prosperous this town seemed to grow. The villagers soon called Guntram their guardian. Before long, people were coming from the farthest reaches of Rheinwald to see the grotesque statue and the boy who had tamed misfortune with his imagination. Time passed, and that poor, unassuming boy grew into a tall, forthright man. After a decade spent talking each day to the Onyx Maiden, calming her imagined rage with stories and songs, Guntram drew the attention of the Empress. The creatures in the hinterlands had been growing more restless every day. Needing a wise and brave counselor, the Empress summoned Guntram. He was given the title of Margrave and a place in her court. The new Margrave gratefully left Somber End at 21 years of age to get everything he'd ever wanted as advisor to the Empire. But Guntram, like a cog in a clock, is just a part of the story. The springs and gears and coils of this story, its very heart, concern Alphonsus and Esme, two children whom the people of Rheinwald would call saviors, who all would claim performed miraculous feats, and who Guntram would try to kill. I can't wait to hear what happens next. Thanks for listening.